Of all the countries that participated in World War II, Japan is without a doubt the most exotic and striking country for a European or American. His military campaigns, less known and studied in our Western countries, are just as amazing as any other that took place in the heart of Europe. As we see in this map, the expansion carried out by the Japanese Empire was enormous, and they acquired a large area of territory in just a few years, having nothing to envy other powers of the moment. However, despite all this, the Japanese army could do practically nothing to stop the Americans, and in a similar way to Germany, they were completely devastated by the Allied side. Next, in this program, we are going to analyze what were the main reasons why Japan was defeated during World War II, in which we are also going to include its biggest mistakes. First of all, the number one mistake that the Japanese made was paradoxically their first act in the war at the end of 1941, with their attack on Pearl Harbor, where they aimed to destroy the American fleet moored there. As you know, in the war on the Pacific Front, it was seen that the most important ship in the fleet was undoubtedly the aircraft carrier, and it was this that imposed naval air dominance in combat. The Japanese mistake was not realizing that the American aircraft carriers were not in Pearl Harbor when they launched their attack, and although they sank many ships, they were not at all significant in the reduction of American naval power. This mistake first led to the entry of the United States into the war without its naval force being significantly damaged, and the subsequent need for Japan to definitively sink these aircraft carriers, which ended in one of its biggest defeats of the war. Many senior Japanese officers were aware that they had awakened a sleeping lion, without causing significant losses. Most analyses carried out after the war indicate that confrontation between Japan and the United States was practically inevitable. Thus, what Japan intended in this attack was to nullify the American fleet for as long as possible, while they launched a major offensive through Southeast Asia, which allowed them to conquer a lot of territory. However, due to this first mistake, the Americans were ready to fight much earlier than the Japanese desired, and after the Battle of Midway, the balance was always in favor of the Americans. It should also be mentioned in this first part of the program that Japan never had medium or short-term plans, and everything it did was the result of continuous improvisation. The second factor that we want to assess in this program is an aspect that its German ally also suffered during World War II. We are referring to a war on several fronts, which prevented them from being able to concentrate on one of them. As we have just indicated, most of the Japanese army was fighting in China and Southeast Asia, and was never able to focus on the Pacific, where it had its confrontation against the United States. Thus, Japan could do nothing but stretch its scarce resources over a large area of territory, which included hundreds of islands in the Pacific Ocean. This had the added difficulty of having to supply a large part of its troops by sea, which was quite vulnerable. To this we have to add a lack of fuel even greater than that of Germany or Italy, and a disastrous logistics system. All these factors generate a negative vicious circle that only worsened throughout the conflict, and consisted of the following. Firstly, few natural resources and low industrial production. This is followed by a huge number of open fronts, and the need to supply them all with ever greater quantities of material. And to close the circle, we have a disastrous logistics system, which makes it very difficult for Japan's scarce resources to reach where they are needed. On the contrary, we have the two main enemies that Japan had during the Second World War, these being China and the United States, to which we have to add the Soviet Union during the final phase of the conflict. Both the United States and the Soviet Union did not have any of these problems, and although the Chinese did not have abundant war material, nor did it stand out for its quality, they could afford to suffer heavy casualties and carry out continuous attrition to the Japanese throughout their extensive territory. To this we have to add other enemies that Japan had to face, such as Great Britain, Australia, and a whole series of smaller countries, which contributed to this great dispersion of Japanese resources. Once we have analyzed the first two sections of the program, in which we have mainly focused on logistical and strategic aspects, let us next analyze the main military errors. Chronologically and from our point of view also the most important, we have the Japanese attack on Midway at the beginning of June 1942. And although the Germans had their Battle of Stalingrad, in which they lost their operational initiative, as well as any hope of defeating the Soviet Union or at least reaching a negotiated peace. The Japanese experienced something similar in this Battle of Midway. In this battle, Japan's main objective was the destruction of the American fleet in the Pacific, placing special emphasis on the aircraft carrier. Furthermore, with this victory they would consolidate their position in said ocean, and would ensure a long period in which the Americans would not bother them again. In short, they intended something similar to what they attempted 6 months earlier at Pearl Harbor, thus completing their initial move. However, and unfortunately for the Japanese, everything ended for them in the worst possible way. The American intelligence and espionage services discovered the entire Japanese plan, and let them continue the attack, but not before setting one of the biggest traps of the entire war. Thus, the Japanese, who were somewhat confident, also believing that their attack was going to be a complete surprise, and with data that made them think that the American fleet, as well as its number of aircraft carriers, was inferior, fell into the trap of their enemy and became the hunted hunter. In total, they lost all the aircraft carriers they used in the battle, these being 4 aircraft carriers, and 250 fighters with their pilots, suffering such a blow that it made them go on the defensive for the next 2 years. In this way, Japan lost 4 of the total of 6 aircraft carriers it had, leaving it with only 2. This defeat was of such magnitude that a few days later, on June 10, at a Japanese High Command War Planning Conference, the Imperial Japanese Navy concealed the severity of its losses at Midway. Only Emperor Hirohito and a few select advisors were informed of the details of what happened, and they preferred to keep it secret from the army and public opinion. This is why it is said that the Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. After this, the Imperial Japanese Navy continued to fight ferociously but lost most of its offensive capacity, which passed into the hands of the Americans. Next, let's look at the other great Japanese defeat in the war, from which the final count began for the Empire of the Rising Sun, whose capitals were completely razed. We are referring to the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which took place during the summer of 1944. This battle, lasting just a few hours, lasting from June 19 to the next day in 1944, was the final blow for the Japanese Navy. Before analyzing what happened there, let's first look at the casualty balance so that we can get an idea of the magnitude of Japan's losses, with 1 year left before the war ended. In this confrontation, in which Japan sought to stop the American advance once and for all, the Japanese lost 3 aircraft carriers and 640 aircraft, which ended up leaving them dead. Once again, the American intelligence services had deciphered the Japanese plan, and anticipated most of their enemy's movements. The lack of Japanese coordination and their inferior situation did the rest, and the Americans once again prevailed. So, and broadly speaking, we once again have a final situation in which Japan tries to concentrate most of its fleet, and launches a desperate attack with which it hopes to buy time, and delay the inevitable. However, after suffering this new defeat, Japan was no longer able to concentrate significant forces to confront the United States in naval battles, and was limited to the desperate defense of its islands, with practically no aviation or ships that could provide support. To this we have to add that things in China began to get complicated little by little, and after the loss of the Mariana Islands on that same date, massive bombings against the island of Japan also began. Although there are obviously more factors, these are in general terms, the strategic and military errors, as well as the industrial and logistical characteristics, which caused the Japanese Empire to be consumed little by little starting in the summer of 1942. So, what did you think of this program? Do you know another important factor that was decisive in the Japanese defeat, such as lack of coordination with its allies? If you want to analyze what the brutal bombing that cities like Tokyo began to suffer from at the end of 1944 was like, I leave that program in the description.